Now, it's time for one of our other favorite U.S. Report regulars, former White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney. Mick, thank you so much for being here again this week. Now, I want to kick off with this whole story about these investigations that Congress is kicking off. Speaker Kevin McCarthy is wasting no time in his new job, and he has released the names of some of the Republicans who will serve on panels to probe the weaponization of the federal government by the Biden administration, as well as the origins of COVID-19. There are some heavy hitters like Jim Jordan, who I have heard described as a pit bull, as well as Dan Bishop, Chip Roy, and Harriet Hageman, who's in Congress after defeating Liz Cheney. What do you make of all of this, Mick, and should the White House be worried?
Should the White House be worried? I think, by the way, James, it's great to be speaking to you again. I'm actually here in Congress right now. A friend of mine has let me use her office today for this hearing, so I'm glad to be here from D.C.
In the room where it happens. There you go.
If you hear it in the background, they're actually voting on some stuff right now. So, look, Biden concerned about this? No, Biden should be concerned about the investigations into the weaponization of the federal government. Absolutely, because the allegations are that he's the one doing it. The China one is a little bit different. Keep in mind, there were, I think, 100 Democrats who voted for the creation of that same commission. So that's got a lot of bipartisan sort of push. But you mentioned Jim Jordan as a pit bull. Jim's a good friend of mine. Jim is a three-time national championship wrestler. In fact, the only match he ever lost was to the guy who went on to win the Olympic gold medal. He's one of the toughest people in Congress, and I wouldn't want him chasing after me, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, what are they looking for specifically? I mean, the thing we see in the headlines here, weaponization of government, but what exactly are some of the things that they're looking at? Is it, using tax authorities or, wiretaps, law enforcement? What are the sort of things that they're specifically worried has happened and maybe happening in the future?
Yeah, keep in mind, this goes all the way back to the Obama administration with the actions of Lois Lerner, then the IRS. I think she was running the IRS at the time, when the accusations, and they turned out to be true, that the IRS was targeting conservative groups and going after them using the authority that the IRS has. So this goes back over a decade, and there's allegations that, for example, you and I have talked many times about the FBI raiding Donald Trump's house, and was that an overreach? And certainly, as they compare it to the way they're dealing with Joe Biden, you can see the reason those discussions were taking place. So this goes back a long way. It goes into a lot of different pieces and parts of the government. So to your original question, should Biden be concerned? I think on this particular circumstance, he probably should, because ultimately all of that executive branch answers to the President of the United States.
Well, we're going to keep covering this as the weeks and months go on the U.S. report, but I want to shift gears here, Mick, and talk about your old boss, Donald Trump, who apparently is heading down to South Carolina, your home state, and one of my favorite states in America, next week for his first campaign event. But I've heard reports in the Washington Post and elsewhere that he is struggling to drum up support and has been making calls to get people to come to his rally. Is this right, and is it a sign the Trump magic is fading as we head into choosing who the Republican nominee is going to be in 2024?
Yeah, it's actually even a little bit worse than that, if you can imagine. It's not even a rally, and that was surprising to me when I first found out about it. And I found out about it through the sort of the media. No one called me to see if I wanted to go, which I thought was surprising. But it's not a rally. It's a private meeting at the State House Capitol with maybe 100 people. And what they're finding is, with a few small exceptions, most of the elected Republican officials aren't coming. Most of the high-ranking Republican Party officials have sort of begged off. So it really does speak to the change in the president's sort of command over the party in a very, very important early state. Remember, as you know, the first couple of states are Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. So if you're going to run for president, you have to do well in South Carolina. And right now, Trump is sort of showing some weakness in that state.
And what do you think that the people who are knocking him back are concerned about? I mean, is it that they just don't want the sort of the media noise that goes along with being associated with Trump, or are they looking at the data point of how many of Trump's candidates fared back in November at the midterms?
It's a really good question. It's a variety of things. It's different for different people, right? For some, he had a really, really poor midterm, and they're looking their hands over it. Maybe they're elected officials and going, well, maybe he can't help me anymore. Maybe, in fact, he hurts me. So if I show up, maybe it's bad for me. Other folks are looking at it and saying, you know what? I'm just tired of the baggage. I'm tired of having to explain Donald Trump all of the time. And probably most importantly, they're looking over the field of potential candidates, including two from South Carolina, former Governor Nikki Haley and current Senator Tim Scott, and saying, those two people are amongst a really good crop of next generation of Republican leaders could we maybe have the same policies as we have with Trump, the same successes without all of that baggage? So I think a lot of this is contributing to it. But at the end of the day, he is having trouble filling a very, very small event in Columbia, South Carolina this weekend.
Pretty interesting stuff. And I want to just sort of move on to something else that involved Trump, which is the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's memoir, which had a lot of interesting revolutions, including the idea that Trump wanted Pompeo to serve as defense secretary. What have you been hearing? What else is in this Pompeo book? And how does Trump come off in all of this?
What you saw, by the way, didn't surprise me. I wasn't aware of it because that story, that anecdote from Mike's book, apparently takes place in July of 2020, and I was gone from the White House by then. But filling two roles was something that Trump was big into. I actually did it. I ran the Office of Management Budget and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau for a while. Once he found people he liked, he didn't want to really grow the family. Keep in mind, he ran a small family business. It was a core of maybe 10 or 15 people. And that's what he was comfortable with. So if he found someone like Mike Pompeo that he liked, he might try and give Mike 2 or 3 jobs. I'm a little surprised that Mike put it out in his book because it's sort of a jab at Trump. But again, if Mike Pompeo is seriously thinking about running for president, which he is, he's going to have to start to find a way to differentiate himself from his former boss.
Yeah, look, that's fascinating. And I think the point you make about the Trump management style is so telling about the way that he wasn't able to cope with the very large bureaucracy of running, the entire U.S. government. Shifting gears finally, though, I want to ask about this one here. Senator Josh Hawley has introduced what he is calling the Pelosi Act bill, after Nancy Pelosi, to ban stock trades by lawmakers and spouses as it comes out that the Pelosi's sold $3 million worth of Google stock just weeks before an antitrust probe was announced. Do you think that this Hawley legislation is a good idea to restore some trust in the legislature, which I think a lot of Americans think gets away with a lot of stuff that if you or I did with our own personal share portfolios, it would be fairly contentious with some of our local regulators?
Yeah, this is sort of a tough call generally because people seem to think that it's legal for members of Congress to trade on inside information, and it is absolutely positively not. But keep in mind, about 95% of the information we get is public anyway. If you go to a congressional hearing, that's public information. In fact, all of the financial journals typically have reporters at these hearings. There was a committee chairman day trading bank stocks during the financial crisis, and he got accused of insider trading, but it was a public hearing. What I think you're seeing in the Hawley Act, and it's a good idea, is that it just goes to that perception of impropriety. There's a lot of folks who have been in government their entire life who are really worth a lot of money. Look at the pictures of Joe Biden's house. Joe Biden's been in the Senate since 1973. He's never made more than $400,000 in his life. Only did that for 8 years. The rest of his time he's making in the very low 6 figures. How do you afford a multi-million-dollar mansion in Delaware? Those questions I think a lot of people have, and to the extent Josh is sort of going after that to sort of say, look, even if it's not illegal, it looks wrong, and Congress needs to be above reproach. I think it might actually get some traction.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. I think the idea that Congress needs to be, as you say, above reproach and not have any of that stink around it would go a long way towards restoring some of the faith in the American government. But Mick Mulvaney, thank you so much for your time this week, and hopefully we'll see you next Friday.